The morning rush at JFK Airport pulsed with urgency and noise as travelers hustled through Terminal 6 with luggage in tow and boarding passes clenched tightly in their hands. Among them walked Brianna Cooper, a strikingly composed woman in her mid-30s, wearing a tailored charcoal pantsuit and low heels that echoed softly on the polished floor. Her demeanor was calm, deliberate, each step purposeful. She moved with the poise of someone used to operating in high-stakes environments, yet not interested in drawing attention. To everyone else, she looked like a professional woman preparing for a business trip. In reality, Brianna was an undercover federal auditor for the Department of Transportation, quietly executing an investigation into racial discrimination in air travel. Brianna's mission was part of a larger initiative to evaluate how passengers of color, particularly black travelers, were treated during boarding seating and in-flight service. Her ticket for seat 2B in first class had been purchased through standard procedures with no special notes or markers. The idea was to blend in, observe, and intervene only if necessary. As she approached the security line, she scanned the faces around her families, wrangling children, business people, typing rapidly on phones, and couples lost in conversation. She placed her ID and boarding pass in the tray with smooth efficiency, aware that even the smallest misstep could draw unwanted attention. She cleared security without issue, but she had already felt the weight of a few lingering stares. At Gate 47, the signs of unease became more visible. The gate agent, a woman named Karen Simmons, glanced at Brianna, then looked again. It wasn't overt hostility, but the kind of scrutiny that carries undertones: doubt, disbelief, suspicion. Brianna stood quietly in the boarding area, holding her ticket and checking the time. She noticed an older man in a navy blazer nudge his wife subtly and tilt his head in her direction. These were the kinds of microaggressions Brianna had trained to detect, not accusations but silent signals, the type that stack up over time and create a culture of exclusion. Still, she maintained her silence. Her job was to observe, document, and report, not react emotionally. When first-class boarding was called, Brianna stepped forward confidently. She extended her boarding pass to Karen Simmons, who barely looked at it before stiffening slightly. "Just a moment," the agent said, typing rapidly on her terminal. Her plastic smile faltered, and her tone shifted to something more clipped. "Your seat appears to be well. Let me double-check." Brianna felt the familiar chill of being singled out. She stood to the side as instructed, watching other passengers with designer luggage and white-collar ease pass through without question. Seconds stretched into minutes. Finally, Karen looked up with forced politeness. "It seems we've had a seating error. I'm going to need to reassign you to another seat." Back in coach, Brianna kept her voice even. "I'm sorry, but this ticket was purchased and confirmed for seat 2B. Karen didn't flinch. "Yes, ma'am, but there was an issue with the manifest. You'll be seated in row 26 instead. Thank you for understanding. It wasn't a request. It was a directive. No offer of compensation, no apology, just a sterile dismissal." As Brianna stepped away, she could feel eyes on her. Some curious, some judgmental, none supportive. The gate agent had made a decision, and no one else seemed willing to question it. She walked down the jet bridge with measured steps, fury restrained behind professionalism. This, she thought, is exactly what I came to find. Settling into the cramped middle seat in the rear of the aircraft, Brianna felt the sting not just of personal insult, but of systemic injustice. She knew what the data said. The reports, she'd reviewed the testimonies from others who'd experienced similar treatment, but nothing compared to feeling it firsthand, the subtle, dismissive way she'd been handled, stripped of dignity and pushed to a lesser seat without cause. She didn't need to show her badge or credentials to know what had just happened. It was more than a clerical error. It was a pattern, one that too often went unchallenged. And now it had a witness. Wedged into the narrow confines of seat 26E, Brianna Cooper took a slow, measured breath and forced herself to focus not on the sting of humiliation, but on the mission at hand. Her overhead carry-on had been stored several rows away due to limited space, and the passengers on either side of her offered no acknowledgement as she slid into her middle seat. The man at the window tapped idly on a phone game, and the woman on the aisle adjusted her earbuds and scrolled through a playlist. Neither noticed that a woman who had purchased a first-class ticket was now sandwiched between them in economy without explanation or concern. Brianna pulled out her phone discreetly and began taking notes, logging the seat reassignment, the gate agent's name, and her tone and recording timestamps with precision. This was no longer just a field operation. It was now deeply personal. The atmosphere in the economy cabin buzzed with restless movement. As beverage carts rolled down the aisle and overhead, bins clicked shut. Brianna shifted her gaze across rows, watching patterns emerge like brushstrokes on a canvas. An older black woman seated across from her had politely requested a blanket 3 separate times, only to be waved off or ignored. It wasn't until the white passenger seated next to her flagged down the flight attendant that the blanket was delivered. A Latino father traveling with his 2 children tried asking for apple juice, but the flight attendant responded brusquely, as if inconvenienced. Meanwhile, a well-dressed white man 2 rows ahead was greeted with a wide smile, a warm, "Of course, sir," and 2 beverage options delivered before he finished speaking. The contrast was jarring, not extreme enough to trigger an outrage, but painfully consistent enough to reveal quiet bias embedded in every interaction. Brianna's mind sharpened as she recorded these exchanges. She didn't need slurs or overt hostility to prove discrimination. The subtleties were just as telling. The flight attendant's facial expressions, the tone of voice, the time it took to respond to different passengers. Each instance was a data point. Her thoughts flickered back to the dozens of passenger reports she had reviewed before boarding this flight. One traveler wrote that she was told her upgrade must have been a mistake, while another described being asked to prove she could afford the seat. All those narratives had led to this assignment, and now Brianna was experiencing them firsthand. The challenge wasn't proving they existed, it was capturing them without disrupting the flow of the flight or breaking cover too early. About 40 minutes into the flight, the cabin had settled into its rhythm. Most passengers were either watching in-flight movies or dozing under thin blankets. The seatbelt sign was off, and Brianna had just typed a note about service discrepancies when she noticed a tall figure moving toward her row. It was Captain Jeffrey Miles, the pilot, easily recognizable from the flight preview screen and his presence during boarding. Trailing behind him was a middle-aged Latina flight attendant. Brianna recalled her name tag read Lucia. The captain paused in the aisle, then nodded politely. "Miss Cooper?" he asked gently, surprised but composed. Brianna unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. "Yes," she answered. "May we speak with you privately?" He asked passengers nearby, raised eyebrows or exchanged glances, but Brianna followed them without hesitation, heart pounding beneath her still mask-like expression. In the galley behind the first-class cabin, the captain's demeanor was both professional and faintly troubled. "It's come to our attention," he began, "that there may have been an error regarding your seat assignment." Lucia, the attendant beside him, looked visibly remorseful. "We just learned that your original first-class seat was reassigned without following proper protocol," she added. Brianna listened carefully, noting that neither of them directly mentioned race, nor did they fully explain what had triggered their sudden concern. "We'd like to offer you seat 5C in first class for the remainder of the flight," the captain continued, "and we sincerely apologize for the inconvenience." Brianna nodded once, offering no sign of how deeply she was analyzing every word, every expression. Was this genuine regret or a hasty attempt at damage control? Returning to her economy row, briefly to gather her belongings, Brianna felt dozens of eyes track her movement. A few passengers seemed confused, others seemed to realize that something unjust had happened. She made her way back toward the front, her carry-on clutched tight, her pulse steadier than expected. As she settled into seat 5C, she sank into the spacious leather seat with a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Yet even as the quiet comfort of first class enveloped her, Brianna couldn't shake the sense that this seat, this apology, wasn't offered because the airline suddenly respected her. It was because someone behind the curtain had realized who they might have just mistreated. The mission was far from over. Just as Brianna Cooper was beginning to adjust to her new seat in first class, the flight's calm routine was shattered by a sudden frantic voice rising from behind her. A passenger shouted from the economy section, panic and urgency cutting through the steady hum of the aircraft. "Don't you walk away from me. I need help. My wife can't breathe." Startled heads turned as the man's voice cracked with desperation. Brianna craned her neck to look back, just in time to see a woman slumped in her seat. Several rows back, her face flushed and swollen. The man's eyes were wild, gesturing helplessly while jabbing at the flight attendant call button. His wife was in the middle of an allergic reaction, her breathing labored lips beginning to swell, clear signs of anaphylaxis. The urgency of the moment was unmistakable, and yet no crew member was at their side. Brianna unbuckled her seatbelt instantly and moved toward the chaos instincts overriding protocol. She wasn't a doctor, but she had undergone emergency response training and recognized the signs all too well. Other passengers began rising, creating space around the struggling woman. "Does anyone have an EpiPen?" Brianna asked, her voice calm but firm. A man 2 rows forward leapt up, reaching into a carry-on for his kit. Meanwhile, flight attendant Lindsay Parker, who had been chatting moments earlier, now looked flustered and unsure. The husband administered the EpiPen as directed, and slowly the woman's breathing began to ease. Brianna remained nearby, helping to calm the couple, and urging Lindsay to alert the captain and request immediate medical assistance upon landing. The cabin remained tense, the ripple of what had just happened passing from passenger to passenger in low murmurs and wary glances. As the crisis de-escalated and the woman was stabilized, Brianna returned to her seat, but her mind was far from at ease. The situation had revealed a troubling pattern. A medical emergency had been ignored until it reached a critical point, and the crew's delayed response could have cost someone their life. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a breach of safety protocols. Passengers pay for a certain level of care and responsibility when they board a flight, and in this case the airline had failed that obligation. Brianna quietly logged the incident details: names, response time, witness reactions. The scene confirmed what she already suspected: this was not an isolated mistake. It was part of a deeper, more systemic issue in how people were prioritized or overlooked based on assumptions, status, or appearance. Later, as passengers settled once more and the aroma of reheated meals crept into the cabin, Brianna was approached by Lindsay Parker. Her eyes were red, her movements hesitant. She knelt slightly beside Brianna's seat, her voice low and trembling. "Miss Cooper," she began, "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for earlier. I didn't mean for any of that to happen." Brianna turned slightly, studying Lindsay's anxious face. There was more beneath the surface. Lindsay glanced around and leaned in closer. "I need you to know something. The gate agent, Karen Simmons. She told me to get you out of seat 2B. She said your reservation was flagged. I didn't understand why, but I followed the order. Now I know it wasn't true." The admission hung in the air, a heavy truth released in a whisper. Brianna's pulse quickened, but her expression remained unreadable. This was the confirmation she had been waiting for. Karen Simmons hadn't simply made a clerical error. She had deliberately targeted Brianna based on her own assumptions, using false information to justify her decision. Lindsay seemed to sense the weight of her words, her shoulders slumping. I overheard her say something like, "She's not going to get a free ride in first class on my watch." The phrase stung. Brianna remained still for a moment, then responded, "Thank you for telling me. I know that wasn't easy." Lindsay nodded, eyes misting over. I don't want to be part of this anymore. If you file a report, I'll back it up." Brianna made a mental note to include this conversation in her debrief and to recommend protections for Lindsay should retaliation occur. The rest of the flight passed in a strange, tense quiet. Brianna sipped from a glass of water and stared out the window, reflecting on everything that had unfolded. A medical emergency, a discriminatory reassignment, a confession, all within hours. Her mind raced through possible outcomes, potential consequences, and the mountain of evidence she now carried. She thought of the woman who had nearly lost her life because no one answered the call button. She thought of the countless others who had been quietly pushed aside without ever knowing why, and she thought of how many of them would never have the chance to speak up. Brianna knew then that this flight was more than an investigation. It was a turning point, and the ripple effects had only just begun. The moment Flight 782 touched down at Los Angeles International Airport, a collective sigh rippled through the cabin. While most passengers were relieved to reach their destination, Brianna Cooper felt the weight of unfinished business settle over her shoulders. As she stepped off the aircraft and into the bustling arrivals terminal, the warm California air was a stark contrast to the chill that had lingered on that flight. Waiting near baggage claim, her colleague Jordan Mitchell, also an undercover federal agent, greeted her with a nod. "You good?" he asked quietly, handing her a bottle of water. "I'm fine," she replied, though her voice carried a note of exhaustion. Together they stepped into a quieter corner of the terminal to debrief. Jordan had been seated in coach posing as a regular traveler, observing crew interactions from a different vantage point. As they swapped notes, an unsettling pattern emerged: repeated discrepancies in how passengers of color were treated, both in seating decisions and service quality. Jordan's observations echoed Brianna's own delayed responses to Black and Latino passengers, curt interactions, and a palpable lack of eye contact compared to the attentiveness shown to visibly affluent white travelers. What disturbed them both was how systemic the behavior appeared, not overtly hostile but consistent and subtle enough to be dangerous. The kind of behavior that rarely made headlines but shaped experiences in damaging, cumulative ways. "It's like they have a mental filter," Jordan said. "They respond fast when they see someone who looks the part, but hesitate, or worse, when they don't." Brianna nodded. "It's not just rude, it's a barrier. A signal that says, you don't belong here." The evidence they'd collected, along with the conversations, timestamps, and names, was forming the framework of a formal federal case. Later that evening, after checking into her hotel, Brianna received a text message from Lindsay Parker, the flight attendant who had confessed mid-flight. "Can we talk?" The message read. They arranged to meet in the hotel's quiet business center, where Lindsay arrived wearing civilian clothes and an anxious expression. With shaking hands, she handed Brianna a small folder containing a signed statement and a personal note. "I talked to Cheryl Moore, the other crew member who was working first class. Lindsay said she confirmed what I heard Karen Simmons told us during boarding, that your reservation was probably fake, that we needed to get you out before a real passenger complained." The words made Brianna's stomach twist, not from surprise but from confirmation. She had felt it in every interaction, but now she had witnesses, names, and intent. The discrimination wasn't just perceived, it was orchestrated. The following morning, Jordan connected with a contact in SilverSky Airlines operations division who provided something that would soon become a pivotal piece of the investigation: internal system logs. With clearance from the Department of Transportation, the agents reviewed metadata attached to Brianna's reservation. There, it was undeniable and time-stamped. Karen Simmons had manually flagged Brianna's ticket as irregular, triggering a silent protocol that led to her removal from first class. No justification had been provided. The logs included internal notes that used coded language like potential identity issue and seat reassignment recommended. But the rest of the manifest confirmed there were no technical errors, no duplicate bookings, and no reason to reassign her at all. It was an act of discretion, used as a tool of discrimination, one that now left a digital trail. The final blow came when Jordan's contact shared internal emails that had circulated the morning of the flight. One message from Karen to a supervisory staff member referenced people who sneak into premium cabins and needing to be more vigilant with certain demographics. The racial implications were clear and now supported by written evidence. Brianna's heart pounded as she read the email twice. This wasn't just about her flight. It was about systemic behavior embedded in company culture. As a federal auditor, she had seen many forms of soft prejudice, but rarely with this level of audacity and carelessness. The combination of witness testimony, digital manipulation of passenger data, and derogatory communication left no doubt. This was targeted discrimination, and the airline would have to answer for it. Back at the Department of Transportation's field office in downtown LA, Brianna and Jordan compiled their findings into a detailed case file. They included official witness statements, server logs, printed emails, and transcripts of interviews. Their report did not merely focus on the treatment of one passenger, it outlined a pattern of abuse that endangered not only consumer dignity but also flight safety. Lindsay's willingness to speak out, along with Cheryl's reluctant confirmation, gave the investigation teeth. In the final pages of the report, Brianna wrote, "The actions taken by Karen Simmons were not random. They were deliberate, targeted, and in violation of both federal anti-discrimination laws and internal airline policies. If left unaddressed, they will continue to erode public trust in an industry built on service and fairness." By the end of that week, SilverSky Airlines received official notification that it was under federal scrutiny. The company's legal team scrambled to respond, but the damage had already begun to ripple outward. News of the incident spread through aviation forums and social media, with other passengers stepping forward to share similar stories. Inside the halls of regulation, Brianna stood with confidence. What had started as a quiet assignment had evolved into a powerful reckoning. And the truth, ugly, documented, undeniable, was finally unfolding for the world to see. Weeks after the flight that ignited a federal investigation, the Department of Transportation formally launched an extensive inquiry into SilverSky Airlines. The process was swift but thorough, spanning multiple departments within the airline. Auditors reviewed passenger records, internal communications, complaint histories, and employee conduct logs stretching back several years. As the evidence unfolded, the picture became painfully clear. What happened to Brianna Cooper wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a troubling trend involving discriminatory treatment of passengers based on race appearance and perceived economic status. Within 2 months, the DOT issued a public statement confirming systemic violations of federal anti-discrimination policies. The airline was fined $2 million, and more importantly, was ordered to undergo mandatory company-wide anti-bias training with implementation deadlines monitored by federal compliance officers. The repercussions within SilverSky were immediate and visible. Karen Simmons, the gate agent whose unchecked authority triggered the reassignment of a paying passenger, was terminated with cause. Her employment records, coupled with witness testimony and internal email logs, revealed not only a pattern of racially biased behavior, but also a disturbing willingness to act unilaterally in targeting specific individuals. Cheryl Moore, the senior flight attendant, who had quietly reinforced Simmons's order without question, received a formal reprimand and was placed on probation with retraining mandated before her next long-haul assignment. In contrast, Lindsay Parker, the flight attendant who came forward and spoke the truth despite the risk to her career, was formally commended by the DOT. SilverSky Airlines, recognizing her integrity and courage, promoted her to a supervisory training position in their Service Excellence Division. Her willingness to break the silence was not just noted, it was celebrated as an example of ethical conduct under pressure. As the news broke across national media and travel platforms, the story gained momentum far beyond aviation circles. Think pieces and op-eds filled airwaves and websites, dissecting the case as a flashpoint for long overdue conversations about bias in customer service industries. Passengers across the country began sharing their own stories. Some eerily similar to Brianna's advocacy groups pushed for broader legislation, and several airlines quietly updated their internal review protocols. Though the headlines eventually faded, the ripples continued. For SilverSky, the $2 million fine was a fraction of the reputational cost they now faced, but for Brianna, the most important outcome wasn't the penalty. It was the policy shift now being enforced in response to her findings. In federal offices, memos now referenced her case as a turning point in accountability standards for domestic airlines. Privately, however, Brianna wrestled with the emotional toll the investigation had taken. The experience of being singled out, silenced, and nearly erased from a seat she rightfully paid for had left deep psychological marks. She'd been trained for high-pressure scenarios, but no amount of preparation could completely shield her from the sting of public invalidation. And yet, in quieter moments, as she walked through terminals or waited in boarding lines, she noticed changes. A flight attendant asking a passenger of color twice if they were comfortable. A gate agent offering an unsolicited upgrade with kindness rather than suspicion. Small things, but to Brianna, they were signs that her work mattered. Her report hadn't just exposed Karen Simmons. It had peeled back the veil on an entire culture of passive bias and demanded it evolve. The Department of Transportation issued a follow-up commendation months later, naming Brianna and Jordan Mitchell as lead auditors responsible for one of the year's most impactful discrimination cases. Their findings were added to national training materials used by carriers across the U.S. Brianna declined media interviews, choosing instead to let the report and outcomes speak for themselves. Her belief was simple. Real change didn't need a spotlight. It needed commitment and follow-through. In internal DOT meetings, she spoke candidly with newer agents about the weight of the job and the human cost behind every case file. Her words resonated not because they were loud, but because they came from someone who had lived through the exact injustice she was tasked to investigate. One morning, several months after the case closed, Brianna stood at a gate preparing to board a new flight. The airline was different, but the scenario was familiar. A full terminal, quiet announcements, and a line forming for priority boarding. She held her first-class ticket, her ID, and her purpose not just as a passenger, but as someone who had helped reform the very process now unfolding before her. The gate agent smiled, scanned her pass without hesitation, and welcomed her by name. No questions, no sidelong glances, no request to step aside. As Brianna walked onto the jet bridge, she held her head high, not just because she had won a fight for justice, but because she had helped ensure that others wouldn't have to fight it alone again. If stories like Brianna's resonate with you, stories of quiet courage, accountability, and the pursuit of justice, we invite you to support our mission at Deep Inside HQ. Our team is committed to uncovering hidden truths, shedding light on injustice, and amplifying voices that demand change. By subscribing, liking, and sharing our content, you become part of a growing community that believes in fairness, transparency, and transformation. Let your voice join ours, because together we can ensure that every story told becomes a catalyst for a better tomorrow.